Marcus, you've had an interesting life. You've had the best of both worlds in some ways. I mean, you've had a phenomenal European education, King's College, steeped in academic excellence. And then you came to North America and experienced a lot of corporate success on this side of the pond. But why don't we start with that? Because that is a courageous decision, right? I mean, in the sense that you could have stayed in the UK, you could have stayed in Europe, you had the credentials. Give me some of your thinking around that, if you don't mind. I would love to see where you're at and what led to you to start placing one big bet after another.
That is a great question. I often think about that because in some ways you can feel that it just happened to you, right?
Yeah.
That it was a series of happenstances. And I think that's not really true if you look at it. I find that if I look back honestly without some sense of just casting luck over everything or good fortune or happenstance, that there was a path there. It's a path I didn't chart a priori up front. I didn't say this is how it's going to be, but probably at each fork, I took a fork that likely ended up where I ended up. And so I like to sort of understand why and how that happened, because it informs you, right? It informs you, and then you can inform your children. I have a bunch of children, so it's helpful to have some perspective there. So I'll share that. I think originally, I think I was quite happy academically in the UK. I went to a very good private school, actually on a scholarship, because we came from little money. My father died when I was young, and as a result, I was raised by a single mother, which always means probably not a lot of money around because she had to only work part-time, etc. She was a teacher as well, so not a lot of money there. And I actually think that's where the story starts a little bit, in that I'm a believer that desire for change comes from deficit. So there's something you're missing. If you're perfectly happy with who and where you are, you don't strive for change. But obviously, I think if I think back to who I was then, despite having a very good education, and it was a free education, even though it was a private school, because I got an academic scholarship. So I was very generous, and I was helped, obviously, by that. I think I had a sense of I wanted to be more than my background.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, did you have a sense, did you have something to prove? Or was there a sense of inferiority? I'm not trying to place words on you. I'm just trying to triangulate here with you what some of those feelings might have been.
Yeah, Ruben, I think that's absolutely right. I think maybe I had a sense that I had a special ability. I think that's okay. I didn't know what it was. I couldn't name it. In fact, I would argue I probably didn't learn exactly what the description of it until I was much older, in my 40s. But I think I had a sense, and everyone has a sense. I like to call it the superpower. And sometimes you don't know what it is, but there's something that you just happen to be very good at. And I think I had a sense that I had one of those. And maybe even I had a sense it was to do with being a quick thinker, because I didn't work incredibly hard, but I seemed to do very well. So somewhere in there was the ability to think quickly. And I think I thought I could do something with that was much more than my background, if I looked at it linearly, suggested. Even though I was at a good private school, etc., I wasn't one of the most privileged kids, and maybe I could have gone on to an average career doing reasonably well. But I think there was a point at which I had this sense of deficit, that I could do more than my background, and I wanted to do more than my background. And that's where my desire to change my path from the obvious path came. The obvious path was actually UK university. So I got a great degree in chemistry and computer science. But even there, I forked, you see, because sort of my natural tendency was to do the chemistry. Physics and chemistry was where my real strength is. But I forked to add the computer science because I thought that would be an enabler. In fact, I received advice very early on from I took a year off before going to college, and an old sage who I met at the university where I was sort of a research assistant in the UK said, perhaps you want to think about adding computing to a pure science degree because it'll set you up well for the future. And I listened to him. Yeah. So I changed my degree to chemistry and computer science. And that was the first fork. And it actually resulted in the second fork, because the person who was my tutor at college was actually a chemist and computer scientist, of course, because that's who they line you up with. And he was the one that said, and I will never forget, if you ever want to make something of yourself, you need to go to the US.
That's interesting. Okay, tell me about that. What do you think he meant by that, and what did you perceive it to mean?
Yeah, and I of course asked him, what does he mean by that? Because I'd visited, I think, the US once and done sort of a Disney Worldy thing, I think probably. But I really hadn't contemplated that. And what he said was that's where all the top research universities are, or at least a plethora of top research universities with substantial funding. And of course, in the UK, there are a few. There's Oxford, Cambridge, and Bristol, and Edinburgh, and others. But real money, substantial money and prestige is in abundance in the US. So he more or less thought that having that US credential, even if I were to come back to Europe, would be seen as a significant, notable credential as opposed to going on the linear path. So I really took note of that. And because probably it resonated with my desire to be different in some way, or overcome my deficit and do something unusual. And it was a courageous decision because I was quite introverted. I mean, as most sort of nerdy people tend to be. So to take this leap to go to a place that I'd never lived, Boston, and commit to spending 5 years there without knowing anyone in an academic environment I didn't know. I didn't really know what US universities were like. In a research environment that was clearly going to be challenging because I went to Harvard and there was no sense that it was going to be easy. Yeah. I think the courage to do that came from my desire to change my trajectory. And this professor had encouraged that change and pointed me in the right direction, because otherwise I might not have known which way to go. But he definitely pointed me, go to the US and make something of yourself. Sort of go west, young man.
No, absolutely. I did the same thing. I came from Norway. Absolutely. A couple of things that I discovered coming to the US, and maybe I'm projecting on you here, but I'd love your feedback on it, is one, the US gave me a chance to reinvent myself in some ways. It was a clean slate. And the second thing was, in the US, Americans tend to love big thinking. So if you're a big kind of thinking kind of person, you want to take place big bets. It's an interesting environment that allows for that. It's an interesting relationship to failure as well. Very different than European perception of failure. Is any of that resonating with you? I'm not saying it hit you on day one when you landed at JFK or in Boston University, but over time, am I onto something here? Did you have a similar experience or whatnot?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. So. Again, in hindsight, I think I recognize exactly what you're saying. But I think what most people can do is early on perceive there's something that fits. Yeah. And I think what you describe is what I perceived would fit. There was an ambition, big thinking, and a lack of pigeonholing you or limiting you to who you were. You could become anyone. And there was an expectation of the PhD at Harvard was that you would become the best in your field within the PhD interval. And so I love the sense that in 5 years, I could be the world's best at something that I entered with, minimal background. I qualified for it, but by no means was I going to be expert in the field that I was about to enter. And I think the Harvard and maybe US mentality was, you will be the expert in that field within 5 years. And moreover, there was a sense that isn't the end. You're not going to just go down that path. That's just the beginning of becoming something. Whereas I think in Europe, my sense, and from all my friends and colleagues back there, there's a sense that the PhD is actually the end. And moreover, the PhD should be in the discipline in which you're already naturally quite predisposed. And there isn't this sense of change. Whereas I think the US loves change, loves big thinking, and I think that goes together with change, and allows you to reinvent yourself as something you weren't the year before.
One of the things, I love how we're doing an anatomy of a courageous decision, or anatomy of a series of courageous decisions, so others can learn from it, your children and others, right? Is in the fact that you decided to chase impact and influence, not necessarily success. Was that a conscious decision? Or was it something that, again, you had an intuitive feeling and and it led the way?
It's a really good question. I think at some point, because I didn't come from a lot of money mattered, but that actually quickly faded. Okay. So I think probably if you had asked me back when I was 20, Do you want to earn a lot of money? I probably would have said yes. But quickly, soon after I started my PhD and then went on that path, it became much more important that I was impactful. And I think that took over. And then, of course, what you want to do is marry the two in some way so that you find a way to be impactful and you make a reasonable amount of money. But it becomes a reasonable amount of money, not a lot of money. Right? You want to be adequately compensated for the impact you have. And that's where I ended up. And that was a very good place. So, yeah, I think I wanted to, and this is another part of courage, I think, is you can be courageous for yourself.
Right.
Or you can be courageous for a collective good. And I think I'm a bit of a hybrid.
Okay.
My self-satisfaction comes from impact that is beyond myself.
Yeah.
So therefore, the idea was I wanted to do scientific or technological work that had greater impact. I didn't even need my name associated with necessarily. That's always the test. I wanted to have impact to feel myself that I had actually made a mark. And that was good enough. It doesn't matter whether it was, annotated, starred, Marcus did this. Obviously, it's nice if, your family knows it. But beyond that, I wanted to have impact. And I think that drove me forward a lot. The courage came from wanting to have a bigger impact and overcoming my, again, introversion and maybe British sort of conservatism in terms of cultural conservatism, not political. And it made me sort of adopt the American ethos and push forward.
So you were willing to sacrifice some recognition and ego for impact. Is that correct? It meant more for you. You got it kind of leads me to believe that was it's a really powerful place to be because it leads to this quiet confidence, this quiet peace. Is that true? You're not constantly chasing external recognition or external validation. You're having the impact you want, and you're at peace with yourself. Am I onto something?
Wow, you should be my therapist because that's exactly right. I wouldn't claim at each point it was that clear to me, right, or that I felt that at peace. But I think you're right that, and maybe of course I chose a path that would put me at peace, and so it's not that I knew what I was doing, but maybe each time I did something with larger impact, the satisfaction I got from that led me to continue down that path. And so I sort of discovered that was where my courage would naturally take me. In that, I don't know why it is. And maybe it's the Britishness, right? The British are great at not wanting to sort of grandstand, and they love the background success, right? The one who, the good, the gentlemanly performance that was, laudable and worthy, but not perhaps acclaimed with to be overt success, right, is difficult. So maybe that's part of the British culture, was if I could be background successful, but in a meaningful way, that would be the highest degree of satisfaction. It's sort of hybridization of the American and maybe British cultural ethics or standing.
But with that also came success. That's what I think is so interesting. Is success became more of a byproduct than the main focus, because you did attain a number of C-level executive positions with tremendous impact and influence, and the title and the recognition. I'd love to talk a little bit about your experience at Bell Labs. I mean, it's interesting because you actually started at Bell Labs very early in your career, and then you came back to run it a number of years later.
Yeah.
So it's two different vantage points. But when you came back, you were tasked to bring Bell Labs back to the forefront of innovation, if I'm not mistaken, or something.
That's right. So let's start with when I first joined. Why did I join? Because I joined because while I was doing my PhD, a Bell Labs scientist came as a visiting scholar at Harvard.
Okay.
Back in the day, Bell Labs had sort of a sabbatical that you could take. It wasn't uncommon in the big industrial labs that you could take a sabbatical. And so you could go off to a university for 6, 9, or 12 months. So a Bell Labs person showed up taking a sabbatical at Harvard. And I was immensely impressed by their ability to synthesize complex ideas and into simple, clear explanations and theses. And I thought, wow, that is amazing. I then started reading papers from Bell Labs, actually probably with that person's papers and then a larger set of papers. And I was struck each time by how succinct the papers were from Bell Labs and how impactful. So they weren't 30-page, and in academic journals, 30 pages, a lot of writing. They tend to be 3 or 4 page papers, and they immediately identified the problem they were trying to solved it elegantly in a simple solution that showed real insight, and all done in 4 pages. And I thought, wow, these guys are something. And I actually hadn't heard much about Bell Labs before that. So when I was graduating, I asked my advisor, does Bell Labs still hire? And she'd said, no, not really, because, it was coming down from the glory days of AT&T. And so the budgets were more limited. But I decided I wanted to apply anyway. And so off I went and got an interview. It helps if you've got a good university name behind you, because there are connections that help you get the interview. So I got an interview. Yeah. I remember at the interview, they said, and it was for a postdoctoral position, which if people don't understand, is basically a 2-year internship that's, reasonably paid, but not well paid. And you're meant to leave after the 2 years. So it's a way that Bell Labs got new ideas in, and it was meant to, selection process in some ways. It's a little bit like, in consulting firms, becoming an associate but not a partner. So Bell Labs did a lot of hiring of postdocs back in the day, but not so much at the time I was there. And they asked me, what do you want to do after Bell Labs? And I said, there is no after Bell Labs for me. I want to become a permanent member of staff at Bell Labs. And they all chuckled and said, well, that's not going to happen because they just didn't hire permanent staff members. It was really,
right. It's a bold declaration, right?
Yeah, and I was an idiot. I thought, wow, perhaps I shouldn't have said that. But I already knew it, you see, in some ways. Yeah. And it was because of this sense that this is a place where people have impact with an incredible efficiency in idea processing, which is probably what my talent is. So it matched my talent really well, the talent of thinking quickly and synthesizing quickly. And I felt at home. And of course, once you do that, there was no other place I could imagine. And that's off it went. And I ended up getting the job. Frankly, there was a little bit of temporal luck. That was right around the bubble. So in 1999-ish,
right.
Lucent, who now owned Bell Labs, had money because the stock price was going through the roof. And so it felt like the new future of innovation was here. So they hired a few people right around that time. And I snuck in that piece of temporal luck and then stayed and did some science. But that's the first version of how I joined Bell Labs. And of course, it felt like home. So, and home, then I wanted to be perhaps the head of the house. And so over time, I started seeing that I could perhaps do more than be an individual, maybe run a larger group. And then I had in mind somehow that maybe I could take this whole thing and, as you said, bring it to the future that it needed to realize, because it was in a place where it was transitioning from being a little bit academic leaning, perhaps quite a bit academic, to being an industrial powerhouse again.
That's an interesting, I think that segues really nicely into the tension that lies within corporate America in the innovation space. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because I bet that I had to lead some courageous decisions as well, fighting for budgets, attention, influence, right? And so can we talk a little bit about what that was like? You came back as president, or you took over as president eventually of Bell Labs, very prestigious institution. And, innovation is always so glamorized. It's innovation and transformation. We have all these buzzwords. But the nitty gritty can be pretty dirty and messy. Let's just dive into that maybe structural challenge there, and maybe broader. Maybe we can look at the broader sense of it as well.
I like it. It's a great topic. And so let's spend a bit of time on this, because I frequently get asked about, one is, did I think I achieved the goal of getting Bell Labs back to where it used to be? And so I can talk a bit about that. And then in a general way, can anyone do that anymore? Because I think the unsolved problem, to cut to sort of the end state, the unsolved problem and it's not just corporate America, it's corporations, large corporations, is how to sustain a research environment that operates on a different time scale with higher aspirations, but much more risky behavior than the business, which operates on a shorter time scale with different aspirations, sort of just profitability and low risk. So John Cotto has written about this idea of two operating systems that exist. There's the fast, agile, risky ideas operating system, and then there's the slower, more methodical volume production operating system that's the company. And marrying those two things, lots of people have tried to do. And I don't think anyone's found the magic formula yet. But that was sort of what my job was, I think, and maybe the job of all Bell Labs presidents has been that. And it's easier at certain times than others. So the easiest time, maybe, is when you have a monopoly. Think back in the AT&T days, because the thing with a monopoly is it defines the market, right? And so therefore, if you are the innovation engine of that monopoly, you essentially define the problem and then solve the problem. And then moreover, you have a vehicle to take it to market. So it's almost perfect alignment.
Yeah.
And it's hard to go wrong then, because you define the market, you know where the problems are in the market, you solve those problems, and you bring a new thing to market. And in doing so, you do some great science, so you win some Nobel Prizes, etc.
It's absolute control.
It's absolute control. And you can think the Chinese perhaps emulate that in a different way by sort of dictating a path from the government down. But with the loss of those, and you could argue the hyperscalers are monopolies in their space. They may not like to admit it, but they sort of are, and that leads to a facility of continuing to lead in that space, because you define the market, you allow or the next set of innovations into that market under your control, and off you go. It's self-perpetuating, sort of a natural flywheel. So I would say that's a good model for innovation, oddly enough. It's not a great model for external innovation to change, but it's a great model for continuous innovation. So I think why everyone doesn't like monopolies is because it's hard for anyone else to get in. And I agree that's the problem. But within the monopoly, if it's got that engine, that two engines, the volume engine and the agile innovation engine like Bell Labs, it works pretty well to get those innovations to market. And you can argue that Bell Labs in that model, and I actually calculated this at once, invented 25% of the internet technologies. And that sounds like, okay, 25%, someone else did 75%. But in my calculation, and I just summed up all the meaningful technologies and their relative importance, the next one was 9%. And I think it was IBM or Sun or something like that. And Apple was down at 1 or 2. So 25% was by far and away the biggest impact of any tech company or tech organization. So that's what Bell Labs was able to do in that era. Xerox PARC and IBM were also, pretty significant players. But that's, of course, then viewed as a closed ecosystem, and rightly so. So regulators tend to come in and say no more. And after the no more comes in, and you get fragmented or broken into pieces, it becomes much harder to sustain research because the risk profile has changed. It's much riskier because you don't control the market.
Right.
The company has competition, so they don't have the revenue that they used to have that would sustain the research. So it ends up becoming quite difficult. And no one solved that. IBM has more or less lost its research. Some Xerox PARC was a famous lab. HP Labs was famous. Bell Labs still there. But if all of those have suffered, Bell Labs probably the least, but because of that break apart of sort of monopolies. So it's a really weird thing that monopolies are good for some things, but you understand why they break apart. And when they break apart, it's very hard to sustain significant research endeavors. Did
you feel like you had to reframe Bell Labs with AT&T and the organization as a whole and say, hey, look, we can't go back to yesteryear. That's done. It's finished. We're trying to chart a new course here. Is that? Yeah,
that's right. So what I decided to do, seeing that writing on the wall, and of course I was living through it because I wasn't present at Bell Labs initially. So I sort of lived through it, and I had the feeling from the ranks of what was the frustration. And the frustration I saw was that the innovations weren't being adopted by the business group. And it wasn't because the business group didn't want them. It's that they couldn't accommodate them within their limited budgets.
Oh, interesting.
So what I started doing is my first job, and I was still in Bell Labs, I became the CTO of one of the business groups for free, meaning I stayed in Bell Labs, but I played the role of CTO, and I learned how the business group thought so that then I could help the innovations from Bell Labs get into the business group in a way that was sort of a natural glide path. And so that worked pretty well. Not all of them got in, but I think everyone accepted that this model works because I could find the merge point because I understood both sides. And so that really started me on the path to, in the end, owning the CTO function for the company and Bell Labs. The whole point was to try and manage that merge effectively. And I think I did it well, but not perfectly by any means, because the merge is a hard problem because the market's shifting all the time. So, Lucent became Alcatel, Lucent became Nokia. And each time that changes, it's because the market has forced a convergence, which normally means the market is depressed. So things are consolidating. And in each one of those, you have to re-navigate that process.
So you were constantly negotiating. You're negotiating with your scientists. You're negotiating with business unit heads. You're dealing with impatience, defending budgets. A really interesting intersection. What did you need to do to keep the relationship harmonious? You needed wins in the marketplace. I guess you needed to see products all the way through the full life cycle, right, and released into the marketplace. Is that correct? Yeah.
Well, again, you're great at this. Yes, that's exactly right. But I would argue because the minimum time for that to happen, to be an invention into a commercial product at scale, and I emphasize at scale, not just first foray into the market, but really being a volume product, is 5 years. So when you're first talking to the business group, and we would joke about this in the end and say, look, I'm going to tell you about your product in 5 years. And of course, a business group who cares about the quarter and the year, they would say, fine, tell me about it, but it was sort of slightly dismissive in a collegiate way because I maintained excellent relationships with the business group heads. And that it's key in life, as you know. If you want to do something difficult, the impossible, if you want, do it collectively. And so it may slow you down. And there's that famous quote about you want to do something fast, do it alone. If you want to go far, do it together. And I think that's what I found is maintaining relationships. And maybe the British part helped a bit because it was, the different leaders, there are American leaders and European leaders in the company, and I could get on with all of them. So that allowed them to tolerate this conversation about a time horizon that frankly they didn't care about because they probably weren't even going to be in their job on the time horizon that I was wanting to talk about. So what you had to do was excite them. You had to get to their core because a lot of them had an engineering or tech background somewhere. And you say, look, imagine we could do this and we could do this amazing thing that's 100 times better. That was normally the pitch went something like that. And by the way, we can already prove in the lab that it's not just a pipe dream. Wouldn't you want that? And they would say, yeah, but it's 5 years away. So we would do it with our own budget. But every year we'd come back and say, look, we've gone further. And at some point we'd ask them for skin in the game, probably around year 3.
Okay.
They had to now either put a person on the project from their side or a bit of money and people and start helping us get it into their roadmap.
Yeah.
And then at that point, the wheel is now, it's 2 gears working together as opposed to sort of being separated by the clutch. They're now coming together and they're spinning each other. And so when it worked, that was always the formula. Didn't mean to say it was always easy because as their budgets went down, of course, the first thing to go is the thing that's 3 to 5 years from now.
Right.
When their budgets were a little bit up, they were much more bullish. And of course, to researchers, that's dispiriting that the thing that was, they thought was going to just become this big thing that they've been working on maybe for 10 years, possibly, suddenly gets the brakes put on. So you have to manage, to your question, you have to manage the research expectations, not let them get dispirited when things don't go as fast. You have to manage the business expectations. It's going to be harder to adopt this than they would like because there's a lot that has to be engineered still to create a product out of an invention. So lots of relationship management is the short answer, but always being optimistic and slightly hyperbolic, but with a rational basis, because people want to believe in a brighter future. And so in a down market or depressed market, you've got to be the one that says, I believe, because everyone wants to follow that, but it can't be irrational, right? It can't be irrational exuberance. It has to be sort of rational exuberance that the business group can hold on to and the researchers can hold on to.
It's like you were a prophet in the wilderness at times, 5 years out, right? Prophesying to him. What came up for me as you were talking was, in many ways, you were selling. You were constantly selling, internally, externally, scientists, business unit heads. Was that hard as an introvert? Was that a hard skill to take on as an introvert?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's the one I probably never solved optimally, because I actually probably should have sold more in a sense of the frequency of selling should have gone up, not the magnitude, meaning the big pitch. The big pitch I was always doing, but the follow up to the big pitch has to be the continuous explanation of the idea all the way up and down the organization, so everyone gets it. And when everyone gets it, then they can all buy in. It doesn't matter if one person at the top says, I'm not so sure, because you've got momentum and you've got again, a flywheel that's moving. I probably didn't spend enough time selling it at all the levels of the organization. And as a result, the flywheel sometimes, when one of these perturbations to the system came, normally financial or market factors, it could slow down or stop, or maybe even go off its axis a bit, and that was hard to recover. So yeah, and that was probably the origin of that, was probably introversion, right? There's a certain amount that you don't want to keep socializing things.
But it doesn't energize you, right? You get energized more from your own time and thinking and so forth. So it's an energy drain. It may be exciting, it may be valuable, but it's not. It doesn't. I can't imagine that would energize you.
The idea part does, right? The pitching the idea, right, and people getting it. Yeah. But you're right. The act of even arranging the meeting is not something that creates excitement. Right. In the meeting, it might actually have been quite exciting, because if you can convince someone of something they didn't think they could be convinced of, and they start engaging with you, that's powerful. But yeah, it was probably just even putting the meetings on my calendar was overcoming an inertia I had, and that probably where I could have done better, so that I had more. I had most of the organization behind me as opposed to parts of the organization.
So you're president of one of the most prolific and respected research institutes in the world. You're a C-level executive in the corporate space as well. You get the best of both worlds in that regards. Why did you leave?
Yeah, that's a good one. And again, I've had a year and a half now to contemplate the decision. I knew that it was the right decision. But I think you only can process afterwards, because it's too complicated at the time, and there were too many conflicting forces for you to understand at the time. But I understand it well, and it's still consistent with what I thought at the time. After a while, you've done the best you could do. And I think the trick and the courage there is to step away when that's true, because it's time for someone else or a different setup with a different aspiration, rather than, flogging a dead horse is the phrase, but you're sort of repeating it. Maybe it's the thing of, expecting a different outcome by the same approach is a definition of idiocy, right? Or stupidity or folly. And I think I realized that my approach I'd gone as far as I could with what I was likely to be able to do. Yeah. And then it was time to step away. I think I was feeling increasingly dissatisfied, possibly a bit dispirited. And as we've discussed, since I had to be the evangelist and the seller, if you want, of ideas, once I felt I couldn't do that anymore, I didn't see that I could be as effective. And it was, I was about 50 years old at the time. So there's a time where you think, do I really want to jump on this again? There was a new CEO at the time. So there was a lot of transitions. And I approached him and said, look, I think I'm not the guy to take this forward for you. He had a different set of aspirations, I think, as well. Maybe it's time to step away. And he was open to that. And I think that was the confirmation I needed, that he wasn't going to drag me into it, and I was sort of trying to leave, and the two were in harmony in that sense, right? And so I opted to leave, and I think I feel that way now. I couldn't have done it again. I needed to contribute the same sort of fast thinking and multitude of different ideas, because Bell Labs is a amazing place of ideas of different technologies and different science. And I love that because I like different thoughts and ideas coming at me very fast. But I do that now with N companies, right? Rather than N scientists at Bell Labs, being about 1,000 scientists at Bell Labs, I do it with tens or sometimes 20 companies who actually say, well, how do we innovate? So that learning I developed at Bell Labs, and I've shared a bit here, I now bring to companies, and I find that a very nice second phase. What's missing, and the good part's missing, I have no corporate BS, right? None.
Yeah, right.
And I have all the ability to influence. I just don't have to do that 90% politicking that is draining. I do the 10% ideation. The politicking is left to someone else. Which
is back to where you want to be, which is impact and influence, right? And it seems like what you're taking from Bell Labs as well. I love how you described them early on. The words that came out from you were crisp, clear, and concise. They could just take these really big ideas and wrangle them down into 3-4 pages of very crisp, clear, and concise thinking. And is that a discipline you're taking with you now into other companies as well? This helping them get to core value very fast and
yeah, that's right. So, and I think I've hinted at this. What I discovered, and I discovered it in a weird way. One of the nice things at Bell Labs is famous people come and talk to you willingly. So I interviewed Stephen Fry, the actor, author, comedian, that many of you will know. And I was struck. He came to visit Bell Labs because he's a amateur technologist, and actually well beyond an amateur technologist. He's a very, very smart polymath who can absorb many, many different ideas. And I had never met anyone who thought faster than I did. And I thought, wow, I can't keep up with him. And then I realized that what people have complained about, so what did people complain about, is they couldn't keep up with me. And it wasn't that I was smarter, I just think fast.
Right.
In an agile way. And that's not better or smarter. It's just, and that's how I discovered the very same thing my people would say is slow down, we can't keep up. I felt I couldn't keep up with him. So, but what it is an ability to synthesize ideas quickly. That's really all it is. However it happens, whether it's probably genetic in part, and maybe in large part. So I have that ability, and that's what I've now apply. I can do many different things in many different disciplines and do it quickly. And that's, of course, what people want. If they want to pay you for an hour of your time or a few hours of your time, if I can synthesize the whole thing in that time, it's incredibly valuable. So that is indeed what I've taken away as the thing I still provide. And I get great satisfaction from that ability. And that is my superpower. It's good fortune, it's genetics, it's whatever it is. But that superpower, when I finally discovered or could name it, it helps you define which way you should go, I think.